Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of Iconic Band Lineups. We got in the co-captain's chair over here, Dr. Michael Antonelli.
Hello,
Happy
Pete.
Holidays. How are you?
Same to you.
Thank you, thank you. We are here at the brewery at Orange County Hops in Walden, New York, and I do want to make mention, heard from a lot of you folks who are probably watching this who really enjoyed your performance at the Sea of Tranquility Fall Fest a couple of weeks back, and how it was such a breath of fresh air and a nice kind of bit of variety added to that program, which had kind of like a little bit of everything, but yours was definitely the jazz corner of the festival, which was really nice.
I really appreciate you inviting me to participate, and I have to say, the concert was such a great lineup and such an eclectic mix of entertainers and professionals and just an array of different styles represented and talent. And I have to say, I really enjoyed watching your show, and I thank you for putting that all together. We need more of that.
Yeah. I mean, it was a lot of work, so we'll see. We'll see what happens in 2021. But I agree with you. I think it was great because we had so much diversity, and there was like a little something for everybody. But more importantly, it's like there were folks, because I spent the entire time during the show and even the bonus holiday edition that we ran the other day in the chat, kind of conversing with everybody. I think everybody really appreciated the fact that there was so many different styles of music, and that even like for instance, like someone who maybe hasn't listened to much jazz, and so they catch that little bit of metal, a little bit of hard rock, and some prog rock, and some avant-garde, and then your segment, and they're like, wow, this is really cool that you got all these different styles. So I think it really worked. So and what was even cooler is like, wait a second, that's the Mike Antonelli guy who's on this show all the time. It's like, yes, indeed.
Well, Pete, you do get around.
In a good way.
Yes.
A good way.
You know a lot of very cool folks, and I'm very appreciative of being part of that circle. Actually, thank you.
Yeah. Well, you're very welcome. My pleasure, actually. So today, we haven't done an iconic band lineup episode in a while. Mike and I have been kind of talking about doing this for a bit, and so it's Miles Davis, right? So Miles Davis is one of those few legendary musicians, and we even talked about this last time I saw you. Frank Zappa's another, maybe John Mayall's another. One of those band leaders who had all of these great musicians and great lineups coming through their band, which catapulted them onto even bigger careers, either solo with other acts. And, when you're talking jazz, Miles was the guy. Miles was the guy who had so many notable musicians coming in as pretty much inexperienced youngsters, learning the ropes, and doing what they needed to do to then be able to go out on their own and strike it big. And there were so many legendary musicians that came from the various Miles Davis bands, so to speak. But there are two very notable quintets in the history of Miles Davis and his music. So Mike and I both feel really strongly one versus the other. I think we both can agree they're both great. But we decided, instead of just trying to pick one and figure out which one we're going to do, Mike is going to take the first quintet. I'm going to take the second quintet. And we're going to talk about kind of who was in these various bands, what's some of the music they created, why these lineups were so legendary, and talk a little bit about these guys that Miles had in his band who then went on to do really great things outside of his band. So Mike is going to kick us off with the legendary first quintet, which legendary for a reason, right, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me just piggyback on what you said and just add, maybe I could add just a little something to that. That the tradition of hiring great sidemen, it didn't start with Miles Davis. It certainly didn't end with Miles Davis, or is not, as you said, it's not just part of any jazz tradition. It's a musical kind of thing that it's been going on since organized music has been around, actually, and recorded music and so forth. Start out with legendary big band leaders like Fletcher Henderson, who brought in great players like Coleman Hawkins, earned his experience with Fletcher Henderson. So did Louis Armstrong in the big bands of the 20s. Then we had Duke Ellington, who kept the band around for 50 years or more at a time when big bands were no longer in vogue, and he financed that band with his own money from royalties he was making. So in the 50s, this was a time when jazz was blossoming, and the bebop explosion that happened in the late 40s with Bird and Diz and Monk, and then later Mingus and so forth, that carried on that very unique style of let's do something totally different that's never been done before. That really happened and exploded with Miles in the 50s, in the late 50s, and his sidemen actually played a real integral part and went on to have great careers of their own, as well as several people who came through Art Blakey.
Right.
Now, realize that in the late 50s, we didn't have jazz studies at universities. We didn't have degrees in jazz performance. There was none of that. You learned from jazz, from mentorships, and from finding your way into the community of jazz musicians who were practicing and recording at that time. And if you couldn't cut it, they didn't want you around. So basically, the people who made their mark were the people who had something not only had the technique and the fluent, or they earned their way not only through their technique but through their unique voices, that they had something unique and different. Because let's face it, all those persons I just mentioned all had their own identifiable sounds, and they all turned into icons, basically. And so that's why I picked this quintet, because I think it was very influential in not only the development of the music itself, but also in the development of Miles Davis. Let's not forget that Miles Davis came to New York and kind of bulleted his way onto the stage with Charlie Parker. And after a couple of years, Bird said, "See ya."
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Miles. Not putting Miles down. I'm just saying that he himself was mentored by.
He was one of those guys.
One of those guys.
What happened to him, he went and replicated.
Exactly. And he found the best unique voices around and exploited their talents in a way, I think, that's just my opinion, of course, that would not only benefit him, but benefit music and the growth of it. So with that, I'm going to present my quintet. I have a picture of them here. The iconic Miles Quintet.
Back from the Stone Age, right?
Yeah, Fred, Barney, Pebbles, and Bam Bam. I mean, now they were rock solid, Pete. You have to admit. That band, especially, no one could swing like Fred.
That's true.
And they pounded out some hits with really chiseled grooves, and enough of that. All right, so now we're not so serious, right? We can concentrate. The Classic Quintet of Miles Davis, the first Classic Quintet, was Miles from around 1955 to 57, was Miles with John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Red Garland piano, Paul Chambers bass, Philly Joe Jones on drums. Then I'm going to expound on that quintet, and just, if I could cheat just a little bit, and talk about the next great one between 1958 and 1960 was Miles and Train again, but Bill Evans came into the fold as a pianist, and Jimmy Cobb replaced Philly Joe Jones on the drums. Cannonball Adderley was added as the sixth piece. So to me, that's the greatest time period, or the most creative time period in my mind, or at least in my opinion, music that I relate to the most from Miles Davis was between those two, the original first great quintet, and then the sextet that recorded Kind of Blue, which became, of course, as we all know, the greatest selling jazz record of all jazz album of all time. So let's talk a little bit about the first one with just a quintet, Miles and Train, and then you had the rhythm section of Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe. In the years between 1955 and 1960, so many memorable recordings were made and recorded, and I think it's important to note that the record companies released those records not in the year most of the time that they were recorded, but had a schedule so that, Coltrane, he's playing Giant Steps in 1960, but he already had that that record recorded. He recorded it in 1959.
So it goes to,
yeah.
I didn't know it went back to 59.
Yeah, so let's see.
So he's already firmly entrenched in Miles' band, and he
left Miles' band, and then that record came out. So there's a couple of periods that Coltrane left, and he came back to the band in 1960 when Miles asked him to join the European tour, only for that tour. And I'll talk about a couple little things, but let me go back and we'll get to that. That'll be my final wrap up. But I want to go back to the first recordings, which were the Prestige sessions, recorded in two dates, May 11th, 1956 and October 26th, 1956. 4 records came out of those dates. They were recorded at Van Gelder Studios in Englewood for Prestige Records. And the first one was called Cookin' with Miles Davis, and that came out in 1957. So, it gets interesting. Remember, these were all recorded in 1956, and these guys aren't just sitting home and waiting for the record to come out. They're making a living playing, and they're playing every night on the bandstand, and they're experiencing new things, and they're meeting new people, and they're exchanging different, sessions with each other, and guests appearing on each other's records, and there was a whole a university of jazz going on in the city at the time.
And it was all very organic.
Yeah.
So for those watching, it was very different back in those days. These guys just played and recorded constantly. And that's how these albums would come about. This is not like a rock band in 1971 who said, okay, we have some songs that we're working on. We're going to go to a studio with a producer, and for 3 months, 2 months, 6 months, we're going to work and put this record together. That's not how these jazz musicians worked in the 50s and the early 60s. They just would go in and they'd record all this stuff over the span of, days, weeks?
Yeah.
And out of it, you get a handful of albums, right?
Right. So, again, the recordings from the Prestige sessions were made in 56. Relaxing with Miles Davis was the second one. It was released by Prestige in 1958. Then Working with Miles Davis came out in 1959, and Steamin' in 1961. Now again, this came out after Giant Steps was released. So Coltrane was no longer around and playing much differently at that time than he was back in 1956 when he was first recording with Miles. So not only were the musicians in the band evolving and doing things on their own and creating their own mark somewhere else, but Miles was paying attention. And he was noticing that once they got to a certain point and they were, let's say, masters of a certain style, they just didn't rest on their laurels and stay there. No, but this was an evolution. It was an evolving stream of music that just kept coming, and new ideas and new approaches were blossoming left and right all over the place here. And again, this is only one little sector of this whole movement, and we're just focusing on Miles Davis, but there were lots of guys around that were involved and finding their own voices at this time. So that was 1956. Let's see. In 1957, when the first Cookin' with Miles came out, Coltrane released an album on his own that used part of Miles' rhythm section. He used Philly Jones on drums, Paul Chambers on bass, and He used Lee Morgan on trumpet instead of Miles Davis, Curtis Fuller on trombone, Kenny Drew on piano, and that was Blue Train, released.
Great album.
Yeah, so he recorded that in September of '57. All right, Miles fired Coltrane in '57 because Coltrane was a victim of the heroin epidemic that was very sadly popular with lots of bebop and post-bop players in the late 50s. And I researched this, that Train locked himself in a room and quit cold turkey. And it was when Coltrane was sober that Miles rehired him, which I think was probably the most prolific time period right in those years from 57 to 60 in both Miles and Coltrane's and perhaps Bill Evans' career. So we're going to get to the sextet, which we're going to talk about Bill Evans in a minute when I get to 1959. But Miles debuted, they released round about midnight the LP in 1957. Some critics said that this was the best hard bop album ever recorded. So, maybe at some point I can ask my friend Dr. Lewis Porter about the connection between Miles and Train. I had some ideas, but I'd like to get him on the show at some point if we're talking about Train, because he's really a very interesting person to talk to, and a jazz historian, lecturer, man full of knowledge, and a great pianist as well. So maybe I'll just put a little plug in for him there.
There you go. Upcoming episode, you heard it here first.
Yes, I'd like to talk to him about some of these ideas, which I'm sure he has a very educated and well thought responses to. So that being said, a couple real cool things happen here. And Miles at Newport, that happened in 1958. So here we are, live sessions from '58. Now we have Miles, Coltrane, Cannonball. Cannonball was hired for the recording Milestones, which featured new compositions by Miles Davis using a concept called modal playing, which I'll talk about that if you want me to. Basically, it departed from the rapid changing chord cycles of bebop and that jazz era that defined the hard bop style. Was the rapid moving chord changes and so forth through usually over standard forms, song forms, the popular AABA song form. That's the classic Gershwin type song form, or the 12-bar blues, or American popular songbook. So modal playing is a concept that was first written about and theorized and published. I wouldn't say it was the first published by George Russell, who was a great composer and musician during the bebop player. Rubbed shoulders with all these guys, and he published something in 1953 called The Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tone Organization, which, for you jazz heads out there, became the first published book on jazz theory and how to represent the chordal structures by a horizontal string of notes that were part of a certain scale. So he kind of applied the modes. Let's play in a mode instead of playing chordal patterns. We'll play on one scale and we'll just be inventive. So it's a more melodic type of approach than a horizontal spelling of chords. It's more a scalar approach to playing music. So that came out in 1953. Subsequently, that became the basis for what has become the majority of jazz education programs now at the tertiary or the collegiate level. They're based on, but that's a thing for another discussion. I don't want to get too off the beaten trail here. Turn off your non-theory heads. I don't want to say, all right, what's this guy talking about now? Stay to the topic. Thank you. Yeah, stay on topic. Anyway, just Miles took note of this and was experimenting and playing with those modes, and Milestones was the first record that he did that on. Then, let's get the recording date here. In 1959, March 2nd and April 22nd, Miles released with the sextet, with Bill Evans on piano, the greatest selling jazz record of all time, which is called Kind of Blue, as we've talked about in a previous show. Wynton Kelly plays on one track on that song. So Wynton Kelly, by the time that was recorded, Wynton Kelly was already in the band. There's an interview with Jimmy Cobb, the drummer on that LP, before he passed. It was a recent interview on jazzwax.com, and Jimmy said that Miles called Bill Evans into the studio and also called Wynton Kelly at the same time, and Wynton said, "Hey, I thought this was my gig."
Was he thinking maybe one of them wasn't going to show?
I don't know. I don't know what was behind the Miles, but there's other stories like that too. Like when, what's the I put down here? Yeah, when.
Hey Bill, I think you better come down to the studio. I got some stuff we're working on. Hey Wynton.
So he's playing both cards at the same time,
right? Because now Bill Evans had already left the band, but at least up until mid '58, Bill Evans was still in the band. This album, Jazz at the Plaza, was recorded in 1958. It's a live recording. It wasn't released by the record company until 1973. So this is with that classic septet, and you can see they're all there with Jimmy Cobb and Cannibal, or Philly Joe's on this one, right? It's not Jimmy. It's not Jimmy Cobb, right? But Bill Evans was the pianist on this gig. So what people don't realize, that I've heard from some jazz, scholars and experts, is that Bill Evans had a lot of influence on the writing of the music for Kind of Blue. And if you listen to the pieces there and the expression coming from that LP, it's a lot to do with, it sounds a lot like Bill Evans and Bill Evans' compositions, even though Miles took credit for organizing a lot of it. It reeks of Bill Evans, in my opinion. There's a lot of his influence went into that recording. So that was released in August of 1959. Wynton Kelly plays on the first track, which is called Freddie Freeloader.
Great song.
Coincidentally, again, Coltrane recorded his first album as a leader for Atlantic Records with all his own compositions, called Giant Steps. Now let's listen to these dates. Kind of Blue was recorded March 2nd and April 22nd, 1959. Coltrane recorded Giant Steps on May 4th and 5th, 1959. So we're talking about a month later that Kind of Blue was recorded. Coltrane's playing Giant Steps. So do you think his head was already someplace else when that was happening? Or, and I guess Miles paid the musicians scale for doing that record. And, of course, he got all the royalties and just called the session together with the guys that he was familiar with, and he knew all their personalities would wanted to see how they would gel and what would happen. And man, the rest is magic. The rest is history, as they say. So that's all I have to say about that.
But, the point we're trying to make here is that, you heard all the names of all the guys who were involved in these sessions on these albums. These became huge names on their own, all of them. And that's kind of the point here. And there are probably a lot of people who are going to watch that for them, that's like the greatest period in the history of Miles Davis music. But he had a lot of different periods and a lot of different musicians. So I'm going to kind of go with, I don't think technically you could say it's the next lineup, because I think there was one or two in between that didn't really last too long. But I'm going to go with what is considered the second quintet, and probably to some people, because it's a little more closer in age, or as far as years go, might have contained some more even more memorable names. So the second quintet, which basically started right around 1965 with the ESP album, and I don't own that. I was looking through my collection. I could not believe I don't own a copy of ESP. I need to rectify that. So this released in 1965. And this contains the first ever appearance together on a studio record of Miles Davis with Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams on drums. So just think about those names right there. At the time, I think Wayne Shorter had a little bit of a name for himself. Herbie had done some studio records. Ron, the good session man. Tony Williams, how old was he at this? Right around this height, 19, 18?
Very young.
Very young. So
extremely young.
Yeah. So again, basically a bunch of somewhat unknowns, and this is the first album with this lineup. And just like Mike was talking about in the late 50s, the burst of activity was also very similar in the 60s with Miles. So they recorded all sorts of different tracks at all these different sessions, and you get an album. What you don't use, you get another album a couple months later. So they followed that up with what is one of my favorite Miles Davis albums of all time, Miles Smiles in 1967. Okay. And I do want to mention some classic tracks from that first one. Mood, Iris, Little One, very notable songs from the repertoire of this band as they played live throughout the decade. Miles Smiles, you have the legendary Footprints, Dolores, as well as Circle. And one thing I do want to mention here, which was the case also with the earlier quintet that Mike was talking about, it's like you had everybody in the band writing, not just Miles. And I think more so perhaps with this lineup is he let them write. He wanted their songwriting talents to come to the forefront. So like Wayne Shorter especially really, really showed his writing chops on these albums. In fact, I think he either co-wrote or wrote by himself probably 50% of all the music contained on all these albums that I'm gonna mention here. And that's pretty significant because he would then take that onto a bunch of solo albums that he did afterwards, but more importantly, when he joined up with Joe Zawinul in Weather Report, those two guys were the main songwriters for a good chunk of the career of Weather Report. So you had a lot of Wayne Shorter classics being penned during this very fruitful period here. So like I said, Miles Smiles, 1967. I do want to read, so there is maybe you know who this guy is. There's a musicologist named Jeremy Yudkin.
Not familiar, no.
Anyway, I had never heard of him either, but he wrote a kind of something about this particular album, but I think it also is very indicative of a lot of these albums. He wrote Miles Smiles falls under the post-bop subgenre, which he defines as an approach that is abstract and intense in the extreme, with space created for rhythmic and coloristic independence of the drummer. An approach that incorporated modal and chordal harmonies, flexible form, structured choruses, melodic variation, and free improvisation. Most importantly, all compositions performed as equals, not just a leader and a bunch of soloists who might solo randomly, not really following any sort of pattern. And I think that's what I love so much about this band, and I love that band too. But why I think I've always gravitated towards this particular lineup is because they are all such strong performers, and they come across as a real unit. And they did that over subsequent albums, which I always really appreciated. So, they call this time period in Miles' career as post-bop. So it's not quite the classic bebop that Mike was talking about. It's not fusion yet, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And it's not quite free jazz, which free jazz was pretty prevalent in the early mid-'60s. It's not quite any of that stuff. It's just Miles. And it's this lineup. So that was 1967. Also in 1967, we had the Saucer album. Okay. This also, brought upon a couple of really memorable songs like Prince of Darkness, Masqualero, and the title track, The Sorcerer. You also had a Tony Williams original called Pee-wee on here as well. Again, exact same lineup. 1968, so again, we're seeing boom, 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 boom. Pretty busy here. Nefertiti, Hand Jive, Pinocchio. Popular songs there. Title track. Also in that same year. So here is where we're starting to see kind of like what Mike was saying about some of the latter albums for that particular lineup. Things are starting to change there. We're coming close to the start of the 1960s. Here, the 60s are starting to wane. Rock music, psychedelic music starting to become very popular. Miles is listening. So with Miles in the Sky, 1968. So here, you're starting to hear a little bit of that thing that was called jazz fusion or jazz rock start to seep into the music. And in this early stage, it's more about starting to utilize electric instruments as opposed to all of the just acoustic, acoustic piano, grand piano, acoustic bass, and obviously the reeds and the horns, right? So here we've got, for the first time, you've got Herbie Hancock playing some electric piano, probably Fender Rhodes. So now we've got someone new joining the recording that's not just these five guys. So a guy, pretty unknown at the time, named George Benson, showing up and playing a little electric guitar. Okay, so that's different. So you got a little electric piano, you got a little electric guitar, and here we're starting to see some of the seeds for what we would see from Miles for probably close to a decade, with really long tracks. Okay, only 4 songs on this album. Stuff is near 17 minutes long. Paraphernalia, almost 13 minutes, and you got Black Comedy and Country Sun. Black Comedy is just under 8, Country Sun just under 14. So a lot of almost like freeform jamming a little bit, but starting to take on a little bit more of an edge. So that real kind of majestic and magical quality of the early albums for this, for the second quintet, now starting to get rocked up just a little bit. And they would continue on Philistic Kilimanjaro, which also, this one came out in 1969, so right at the end of the decade. Here we have the first break in this lineup. So I believe half of this album contains the original second quintet, but then you've also got a couple of tracks that feature Chick Corea and Dave Holland on electric piano and bass. So Ron Carter out for those sessions, Herbie Hancock out for those sessions, but those guys would show up on later albums, In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, and this wonderful album, Jack Johnson, right here, where you've got like this amalgam of different musicians, mostly so you've got...
Hey, nice shirt, Pete.
You just noticed that now? I bought this especially for today. You got John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham and... Keith Jarrett and Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, multiple keyboard players, multiple horn and sax players, all that sort of thing. But with Philistic Kilimanjaro, really starting to move into that electronic territory. Okay, here you've got some blues elements, you've got a little bit of dance grooves, a lot heavier on the grooves, electronic elements, all coming into play. Tout de Suite, Mademoiselle Mabry, the title track, all really signaling the direction that Miles was moving into on In a Silent Way, and especially with Bitches Brew. And kind of like Mike was talking about earlier, too, with the surplus of lots of really good live albums from this period. I would say if you want to hear the ultimate live document of this lineup, the complete Live at the Plug Nickel is probably the most famous, I would think. And there's one other one here too that Mike was nice enough to bring. So this is the Water Babies album. So this was released, I think like a decade later.
1976.
Yeah, so about a decade after this band kind of stopped functioning as a solid unit, and these are recordings taken at these many sessions that didn't make those earlier albums. So very notable as well as kind of like the long lost second quintet album.
And I failed to mention in between the evolution of Miles Davis, which is something that just kept moving and moving. Throughout the decades that he was involved in music, from the 40s right up on through to the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Is that one of the in-between periods there, Miles did something totally different, totally out of character or off the beaten path, called his sessions with the great arranger Gil Evans, with the album Sketches of Spain, Porgy and Bess. Yep. And those things that were basically made with studio orchestras, and the great arranging talents of featured of Gil Evans. I told you not to call me now.
We have a little musical accompaniment. That was perfect.
Yeah, that's from a Joe Lovano recording. That song anyway. That's my ringtone. So in 1960, recorded November 15th, 20th, 1959. Again, this is right before the legend, or right after the legendary Kind of Blue album. And he did have Miles with Gil Evans Orchestra. He did have Jimmy Cobb on drums and Paul Chambers on bass on that recording, and also Elvin Jones, who was part of Coltrane's quartet. Of course, Jimmy Cobb later played on Coltrane's Giant Steps album as well. So there's a lot of commingling with bandmates going on here, and sharing of each other's ideas, and I think that's how the relationships forged during all these time periods with the different musicians, no matter who was the leader, was the backbone and the strength of this music, is that everyone was sharing and creating at the same time, and taking their ideas to the next level by virtue of the learning community and the tight-knit community and the bond they all shared as musicians trying to make their living in the jazz world.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned learning, because that's where I was going to go next. I think that all of these guys learned from each other. They learned what it took to be a leader themselves if they wanted to go that route.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, look at all of the guys that we've been talking about. Obviously, Coltrane. Cannonball Adderley has great recordings of him as a leader. Tony Williams went off and formed the Tony Williams Lifetime. Herbie Hancock had a hugely successful solo career.
Still has
a hugely successful solo career. Ron Carter worked with everybody.
Yeah.
Wayne Shorter, co-founded the band Weather Report, who were a huge band. Weather Report, one of those jazz fusion bands that broke into the mainstream. So there's no shortage of talent that came from these two lineups and all the other ones that Miles fronted. I mean, we could talk for hours about all the other musicians that played in various other eras of the Miles Davis band, who went on to even greater things on their own. I mean, it's I don't know if we have enough time for that.
Yeah.
But I do want to, before I forget. So you were talking about Sketches of Spain before. For decades, whenever I meet someone who is on the fence about jazz, and they're like, well, I don't know, the little jazz I've heard, it's very complicated, it's very kind of noisy and all that kind of stuff. You know what I generally say to them? Go listen to Sketches of Spain let me know what you think, because that album is not very indicative of a lot of the other albums that we're talking about, and I think that is a jazz album that anybody can enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, is it really a jazz album?
Probably because it isn't, right? Yeah,
because it has improvisation, doesn't necessarily.
It's more of a classical album, right?
I mean, the writing style is not. You can't call it. Does it fit into any of the square? I'm using square and jazz in the same sentence is not appropriate. Actually, the same peg as any of the stylistic jazz that we've heard to this point. Not at all.
Yeah.
So it's unique in its way. And I mean, it's music, okay? It's expression. I really am one who eschews all the labels that we put on. And yet, being a university-trained musician, I know there's a reason that we have to have curriculum, and we have to have some kind of standardized way to present the information to the new generation of students. But that was not the case with this music. It was, bring what you got to the table, let's all pitch in, and we'll decide amongst ourselves what works and what doesn't work, and we're all going to grow from each other's experience. And really, I think that is the heart of this music.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. Well said. Now, because I know we're going to get asked by someone or multiple people in the comments, it's like, this was great. I don't have any of these albums. I want to start off with one album from each of these lineups that you guys are talking about. What would you recommend?
Well, if you haven't heard it yet, start with Kind of Blue, because that'll set you up for a whole plethora of jazz that sprang from that idea of playing over just a couple of, or soloing or creating music over just an idea or a concept other than a standard song form, where some of the people who haven't heard any of this kind of music or are new to it might say, like you said, oh, it's a little too complex. I mean, Coltrane was running sheets of sound up and down and all kinds of crazy licks and ideas back in the hard bop period. But again, he's learning how to conquer his instrument. And Miles, on the other hand, I think really found his niche when he decided to relax and create within his classic muted harmon mute sound, create within that and to create things that weren't so bombastic,
right?
But yet were truly unique to him. So let's face it, Miles didn't have the chops of a Kenny Dorham or of a Clifford Brown or even Dizzy Gillespie. Miles technically couldn't keep up with those guys. If it was a race, if it was a foot race, Miles would be a couple laps behind. Thankfully, music is not a competition of a foot race to see who can play the fastest. And even though that's impressive and it's astounding in some respects, it's not the essence, I don't think, and the heart and soul of what the music is about. It's about creating something that is unique to you. Yeah. That speaks your voice. And in cooperation with the support that you get from the room of musicians that you're playing with, if you happen to be playing, in a quintet or a quartet or a trio
And I think he always felt confident that he was surrounded by the best. So whatever that musical vision that he had was, they would be able to execute it.
He was the headliner during the early or the late 50s who brought a lot of these guys' names to the forefront. Because let's say he was the showman. Yeah. Miles was the showman. He was the talent scout. Yeah. And he attracted, maybe because Miles had the best recording contracts. Oh, you don't know. I don't know. What was so special about it? But I'm thankful that he did what he did.
Yeah. It's amazing like how many recordings are out there. It's like I own a ton of Miles Davis stuff, but then I came here today. I'm like, how do I not have ESP? It's the same thing with like Frank Zappa. I've got like a whole shelf full of Zappa CDs at home, but yet there's like so many more that you possibly get. And it's just, that's how prolific guys like this were throughout their careers. And Miles recording starting in the late 40s all the way through till when he died. So and that's a long time, long time. So my recommendation for the second quintet, I'm kind of torn here. I would probably go with Miles Smiles. Although if you wanted to give Saucer a try, I wouldn't argue with you there. I would say if you want a real nice sampling of a lot of stuff, go check out the Complete Plug Nickel recordings. That's a smoking live album that has this particular lineup. So, but you could literally get anything from these two periods here, and you're going to get some really, really classic jazz there. So, any last words, Mike?
I think we covered pretty much everything I wanted to say.
Cool, I think so.
Thank you.
So there you have it. There's another iconic band lineup show, but here we've got two of them, right? Two of them by the great Miles Davis. Like I said, we could easily do another show on a couple different lineups that he's had, because there are a lot of good ones as well. I could easily think of one or two of the 70s lineups that I think were really good. And quite frankly, that early 80s. I mean, you saw him in the 80s, and that lineup with Schofield and Mike Stern and drawing a blank on the other Bill Evans.
Bill Evans,
yep.
the tenor player. Bill Evans,
yep.
tenor sax.
Yeah. So, there's quite a lot of them. So there you have it. So if you have any of your favorite Miles Davis lineups from throughout his long, illustrious career, feel free to discuss them in the comments below. Or if you just want to comment on either of these and the albums and why you like them, that's welcome as well. So visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, of course. We're here on YouTube all the damn time. I do want to give everybody a wish for a wonderful, happy New Year. We've been taking a little bit of a break here over the holidays because we haven't been quite as busy, but we've got family over and all that sort of thing, so it's kind of hard to be recording stuff. But tonight, join us for another Monday evening with the Hudson Valley Squares. That'll be coming up tonight, and then probably going to be a little light on content over the next few days as we move into New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. So, but then starting next week back on the regular schedule. So we'll see you all then. I want to thank Mike once again for coming on and helping us with this.
My pleasure, as always.
Pleasure having you.
And I wish all your listeners and all your subscribers a wonderful 2021, and let's hope that the agony that was 2020 is going to be something in the rear view mirror very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So look forward to Mike coming back on the show sometime in early 2021 for that John Coltrane episode. So you heard it here first today. So that'll be coming up, and we'll see you all then. Have a good one. See you tonight, guys, for the Hudson Valley Squares, and have a good one. Bye-bye.